I think there's a common misconception around rent to own in that it's always a scam or that it's never a good idea. In general, I would agree that rent to own is not a good fit for most people. Most people should rent or wait and get traditional financing because it's just so much more clear that when you're a tenant, you're a tenant. When you can get bank financing, you're the owner, you pay the property taxes, take care of the home. And rent to own is less regulated, so there's a lot more gray area. In general, rent to own usually covers two different things: lease with an option to buy or a contract for deed. And I think that rent to own is more close to a lease with an option to buy because you're a tenant with the exclusive option to buy, you're paying rent, whereas on a contract for deed or a land contract, you're actually making a interest payment to the owner. And you got to remember, there's actually two sides to the equation. There's the tenant and then there's the owner. The tenant wants to put the least amount down, wants the nicest house, wants to pay the least amount in rent, and wants the most rent credit on the property and the lowest purchase price. The homeowner wants the highest purchase price, the highest monthly rent. They want the most skin in the game so that someone doesn't move into the house and they have to evict or foreclose on them. So they want the least risk borrower. So you got to find somewhere in between where this makes the most sense. And there's actually two different ways to get into a rent to own home. There's people that have inventory already that will list it for rent or for sale that they might consider a rent to own. There's very few websites that'll specifically show you listings of rent to own only inventory, but there are some in some local markets. So usually a tenant has to approach the seller directly or negotiate it with their real estate agent. Now, if you're an owner trying to sell a property, you typically just want your money and be done with it. So most of the time, all of the homes listed for sale typically aren't interested in a rent to own or seller financing situation because they have a mortgage. They're just trying to get their cash out and buy their next property or do what they can. But for homeowners that are renting the property, I've found that there's more success that way. If you approached a home in your local market that was currently a rental or being advertised as a rental, or maybe you're living in that home already, that has a stronger possibility that someone would consider it based on the risk, how much you're willing to put down, how long the term is, what your monthly equity gain is going to be, and kind of the finer details of that. And having sold a couple of my homes personally as rent to own, and having our business colleague right now living in a rent to own home, we've actually seen both sides of it, where we've seen both from living in the home, hoping to eventually buy it. Essentially what my business colleague did is he said, hey, I want to actually get this home in, lock a really good price, and from there I'll be able to make a monthly rent payment, earn some credits, and I think that the home's going to appreciate way more than what I'm locked in for a purchase price for. And the seller in that situation just had an existing inventory of a property, and they just I just want to stop making the monthly payments. I don't want to have a taxes and insurance and a monthly mortgage. So if someone can just cover that, I'm feeling pretty good about that. So that's where an arrangement can work out very good, where it's existing inventory. Otherwise, you got private companies which will actually buy homes listed for sale and then sell to you as a rent with an option to buy. Now, these are typically higher cost because they got to go out and purchase the home. So if it's a $300,000 house, let's say that the tenant's coming in with 7%, let's say that's $21,000. Well, there's still $279,000 of capital plus closing costs that need to occur to make that transaction possible. So that's why if someone already owns the home, that's easier to negotiate terms with someone that already is the property owner. But there are companies that specialize specifically in buying homes across the United States. We're one of those companies. There's, we got Home Equity Partner, you got Zegacy, you got Home Partners of America that used to do it, you got Divvy Homes. So it's not unimaginable, but there's just kind of nuances, and each one has their own market, their own specialty, their own pricing for making that happen. Some of the other misconceptions around rent to own is that all tenants will buy. I remember looking up the data and finding that a Pew Research study done in 2022 stated that roughly only 25% of rent to own arrangements will actually come to fruition. Now, it's hard to get the data on what that looks like, but that's not good. If you're moving into a rent-to-own home, unless you're truly moving in with the option to buy and you don't really care whether or not you're going to buy that property, you're kind of just test driving it. But for most people trying to do rent-to-own, is they're trying to get into the home and buy it eventually. And so when you look at those two ways, if you're moving into a home, you want to move into it underneath a land contract. So now that's where you're actually showing up on title. You make principal and interest payments. You have like an amortization schedule. So if you're moving in and you're a buyer, you want a land contract because that gives you the most protection. However, most of the time people are going to want a substantial down payment, 5, 10, 15, 20 or more % down, because they're essentially financing the home for you. And if they default, it's a foreclosure. Now, if you're selling a home, you want to sell a home as a lease with an option to buy because you retain title, you get the tax depreciation benefits. It's typically an eviction over a foreclosure. And so seeing both sides of the equation, when you live in a home, you want a contract for deed or land contract. If you're selling a home, typically you sell it on a lease with an option to buy, or sometimes called a lease purchase option. And so those are the two sides. But just remember, both sides are competing for the same or for competing goals in terms of risk, reward, home selection, home progress. But there's definitely ways to make that happen. So if I'm a tenant and I'm trying to get to a rent-to-own home, I'm reaching out, I'm networking, I'm talking with agents, I'm talking to real estate investors. I'm trying to find homes that someone's willing to do a rent-to-own arrangement with me. Yes, they might look up my credit score. Yes, they might find some things, and rent-to-own isn't a strategy to solve some other issue. So if you got credit score, if you're have more expenses than income, every month, rent-to-own isn't going to solve that underlying issue. But if you've been renting for 5, 10, 15 years, you always pay on time, but you're just getting priced out every month or every year that home prices keep going up. Okay, great. Maybe 10% of your monthly payment can go towards it, and you lock in a set 4% per year appreciation, so that that $300,000 home isn't worth $400,000, 4 years from now. You could lock in a $340,000 purchase price. And I'm just using numbers as an example. And so if I'm a tenant, I'm looking that way. I'm also looking at what some of these other companies can offer me. I've seen different models where you got people that maybe have lower income that are trying to find homes, in the 100,000 range. Then I got people that are self-employed. They're making $300,000 a year, and the bank still can't get them a loan because of their debt to income ratio. They maybe need 2 years of tax returns, and they don't want to move twice. So that's where it can make sense to get really creative, maybe pay a premium so you don't have to move twice. On the investor side of things, most investors already have inventory that they're offering rent-to-own homes. Sometimes companies will buy, fix, and rehab the properties to then list as a rent-to-own arrangement. Or there's other companies like myself that are trying to buy new properties. Maybe they have a private equity firm, they have some capital, and they're looking to deploy it on a 1 to 3 year bridge so they can help someone get into a home, maybe get a higher return on their investment, and they can acquire properties that way. So those are some of the misconceptions, some ideas, some suggestions. Happy to answer any and all questions related to rent-to-own. Thanks.